What if I told you that one of the most famous popes in history dug up a dead guy and put him on a trial? I'm not kidding. They put a corpse in a chair, dressed him up, and started yelling questions at him, or that a church that preaches peace literally massacred 120 people, including kids, and then lied about it for decades. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. This is real history, the kind they never, ever teach you in Sunday school. The stories you did learn about perfect saints and heroes are just the highlight reel. It's a story made to make you feel good, but it hides a crazier, darker, and way more human truth. The real story of the church isn't a straight line to heaven. It's a messy, bloody, and scandalous fight for power. And today, we are exposing everything. We all know the official story. It starts with the apostles, spreading the word against all odds. We hear about martyrs bravely facing down lions. Then we fast forward hundreds of years to heroes like Martin Luther fighting corruption. It's a great story. It's clean, it's inspiring, and it is completely, dangerously wrong. The problem with this highlight reel is it makes the church look like this perfect thing, guided by God from one wind to the next. It totally ignores the insane fights, the shocking hypocrisy, and it erases the people who were crushed by the very church that promised to save them. But what if the real history, the insane history, is actually more valuable? What if you need to know about the scandals and the atrocities to understand any of it? The story of the church isn't about perfect people in stained glass windows. It's the story of what happens when flawed, ambitious, and sometimes straight-up evil people try to claim they speak for God. It's a story of brutal splits that happened long before Martin Luther, of leaders who literally rewrote their own history books, of insane violence and scandals that prove power corrupts. This is the history they hid from you, and it's time you knew. Section 1. The Myth of Unity, Early Church Chaos. That perfect picture of the early church, all unified and happy right after the apostles? It's probably the biggest myth in the entire story. The Bible gives you one picture, but what happened next wasn't peaceful. It was a complete explosion of competing ideas, rival leaders, and insane fights that almost destroyed Christianity before it even started. The idea of one early church is a total fantasy. The reality was a theological battle royale. Two controversies prove it: the Montanists and the Donatists. These weren't small disagreements. These were all-out wars that forced the church to define itself by kicking people out. First, the Montanists. From the mid-2nd century, led by a guy named Montanus and two prophetesses, Priscilla and Maximilla, this was a charismatic explosion. They claimed God was still talking, and that they were starting a brand new age of the Holy Spirit. Montanus even said he was the Holy Spirit Jesus promised to send. This new prophecy was wild. It was all about intense worship, getting messages directly from God, and a super strict lifestyle. They fasted like crazy, said you could never remarry, and ran towards persecution, thinking it was a betrayal to run away. They looked at the mainstream church and saw a bunch of lazy, compromised fakes. And they had female leaders whose prophecies were treated like the Word of God, which was a huge challenge to the all-male bishops who were just starting to take over. You can see why the bishops freaked out. They were trying to build a stable institution with a finished Bible and a clear chain of command. The Montanists, with their new prophecies, could burn that whole structure to the ground. If God is talking to anyone, who needs a bishop? The church's response wasn't to talk it out. It was to crush them. Montanism was labeled a heresy. The door was slammed shut on the idea that God gives new revelations, and that move cemented the bishop's power for centuries. Even crazier and more violent was the Donatist schism in North Africa in the 4th century. This fight was about what happens after you've been persecuted. The Roman Emperor Diocletian launched a massive attack on Christians, forcing them to hand over their scriptures to be burned or be tortured and killed. The people who gave up the books were called traditores, literally traitors. When the persecution stopped, the church ripped itself in two. What do we do with the traitors, especially the priests and bishops who caved? Could a baptism from a traitor priest even count? This question lit a firestorm. One side, led by a bishop named Donatus, had a simple answer. No way. They believed the church was for saints only. A sacrament from a tainted priest was worthless. So when a guy named Caecilian became Bishop of Carthage, the Donatists went nuts, because one of the guys who ordained him was accused of being a traitor. They immediately elected their own bishop, and the war was on. This wasn't just a debate, it became a rebellion. The Donatists saw the other side, which had the support of Rome, as completely corrupt. For over 100 years, North Africa had two different Christianities, with their own churches and their own heroes. It got violent, with radical Donatist groups attacking people. The Roman government kept siding against them, which only made them feel more righteous. Ultimately, the Donatists weakened the North African church so much that it was eventually wiped out. The key takeaway here is that unity was never the default state of the church. It was forced. It was built by crushing anyone who challenged the people in power. The early church, we imagine, was a dream. The reality was a war for the soul of Christianity. Section 2. Forging a narrative, rewriting history. If the early years were chaos, the next few centuries were all about controlling the story. History is written by the winners, and in the church, this meant literally making stuff up and burying the truth to build power and look perfect. For one of the most insane and proven examples of this, look no further than the early Mormon church under Joseph Smith. It's a master class in how you can invent your own origin story. The story told to millions of Mormons is about angels, miracle translations, and a divine priesthood. But when you look at the actual history, you see something else. Retroactive editing, convenient lies, and the brutal shutdown of anyone who disagreed. One of the church's biggest claims is that the priesthood was restored by angels. The official story is that in 1829, John the Baptist, and later Peter, James, and John, appeared to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and gave them priesthood authority. This is the foundation of their entire church. The problem? There's zero mention of this in any early church documents. The story of these massive angelic visitations seems to have been invented years after it supposedly happened, and then inserted back into the history books. This pattern of rewriting history happened with their own scriptures. The Book of Commandments, published in 1833, had Smith's revelations. But when it was republished just 2 years later as the Doctrine and Covenants, many of the revelations were completely changed. We're not talking about fixing typos. We're talking about fundamentally changing doctrines to give Smith more power. Revelations that once sounded humble were rewritten to make him the one and only prophet. He was literally changing the past to fit his present. Even the story of how the Book of Mormon was translated got a complete makeover. The official story you see in paintings is Joseph Smith studying the golden plates like a scholar. But according to eyewitnesses, including his own wife, the reality was way weirder. Smith almost never even looked at the plates. Instead, he'd put a seer stone, a rock he'd used for treasure hunting, into a hat, stick his face in the hat, and then dictate the words. This process, which looked a lot like folk magic, was totally hidden to make the story seem less weird and more respectable. But what happened when people on the inside knew the truth and tried to talk? They were crushed. Oliver Cowdery was one of the main witnesses to the Book of Mormon, basically the co-founder. But when he called out Joseph Smith for having an affair, Smith didn't apologize. He had Cowdery excommunicated. His crime wasn't lying. It was telling a truth that made the prophet look bad. The most extreme example came in 1844. High-ranking church leaders had become disgusted by Smith's secret polygamy and his massive political power. They started a new newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, to expose him. In its first and only issue, they revealed everything. Joseph Smith, who was the mayor of the town, declared the newspaper a nuisance. Then, on his orders, a posse from the church's private army stormed the newspaper office, smashed the printing press, and burned every copy. It was blatant censorship to protect his secrets. That act led directly to his arrest and ultimately his death at the hands of a mob. These aren't small details. They show you how religious authority is built. You sanitize your story, you retroactively add angels, you rewrite your own scriptures, and you violently shut down anyone who disagrees. It shows that protecting the image of the institution and the leader was more important than the truth. Section 3. When faith turns violent. The Hidden Atrocities. The story of Christianity is usually told as a story of victims, people thrown to lions or burned at the stake. And that's a true part of the story, but it is not the whole story. The clean version ignores the horrifying times when the church wasn't the victim, but the killer. It leaves out the times when faith and paranoia led to atrocities that are just as bad as any in history. And no event shows this better than the Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857. This was not some random act of violence. This was a planned mass murder organized by local Mormon leaders in Utah. It ended with the murder of 120 men, women, and children in a wagon train. What came next was a massive cover-up that went all the way to the top. To understand how this happened, you have to know what Utah was like in 1857. It was a powder keg. The Mormons had been chased out of 3 different states. Now, the U.S. government was sending an army to Utah, and their leader, Brigham Young, was delivering insane speeches, talking about revenge and telling his followers to treat all outsiders as enemies. Into this madness came the Baker-Fanker Party, a wagon train from Arkansas. As they traveled through Utah, tensions exploded. Mormons refused to sell them food. False rumors started to spread that these people were the same ones who had killed Joseph Smith. They weren't seen as travelers. They were seen as invaders. As the wagon train camped in a place called Mountain Meadows, local Mormon leaders, including a stake president and a militia major, decided to attack. The plan was evil. They got some local Paiute Indians And along with Mormons disguised as Indians, they attacked the wagons. But the families fought back hard, holding them off for 5 days. This created a huge problem. The survivors had seen that their attackers were white. They knew Mormons were involved. If they got to California, the story would get out. So, the Mormon leaders made a decision. Kill every single witness. This is where it goes from a battle to a disgusting betrayal. A militia leader named John D. Lee approached the camp with a white flag. He promised the terrified families that if they gave up their weapons, the Mormons would protect them. The families, exhausted and desperate, agreed. They separated the wounded into a wagon, followed by the women and children. The men walked behind, each one next to an armed Mormon militiaman. Then a signal was given. The militiamen turned and shot the unarmed men at point-blank range. The others then swarmed the women and children. About 120 people were murdered. The only survivors were 17 small children, too young to tell the story. What happened next was the cover-up. They buried the bodies and immediately blamed the entire thing on the Indians. For years, the church pushed this lie, protecting the killers. But the truth eventually came out. Years later, to save the institution, the church needed a scapegoat. They made a deal and threw John D. Lee under the bus. He was the only person ever punished. 20 years after the massacre, he was executed by firing squad at the exact spot where the murders happened. The Mountain Meadows Massacre is a terrifying story of religious extremism. It shows how fear and propaganda from leaders can lead to unimaginable violence. But the cover-up reveals the scariest part, the institutional need to protect the church at all costs, even if it means sacrificing truth, justice, and the memory of 120 innocent people. Section 4. The Battle for Control, Councils, and Crusades. In the Disney version of church history, big meetings like the Council of Nicaea were these calm, holy gatherings where everyone agreed on theology. But that's a joke. Forget a quiet debate. Church councils were brutal political fights. They were weapons used to force everyone to believe the same thing, crush anyone who disagreed, and draw lines in the sand with blood. They weren't just about figuring out God. They were about grabbing power. And no council was more obvious about this than the Council of Trent. Held over 18 years in the mid-1500s, the Council of Trent was the Catholic Church's massive, angry response to the Protestant Reformation. By the time it started, Martin Luther had already shattered Europe's religious unity. The Catholic Church was in a fight for its life, and Trent was its war room. The Protestants hoped for a real debate. That was never going to happen. The Pope's goal was not to talk. It was to completely destroy the Protestant heresy. So, with only Catholics in the room, they circled the wagons. Session by session, Trent slammed the door on any hope of compromise. The Protestant idea of being saved by faith alone? Cursed. Trent said anyone who believed that was damned to hell. The Protestant idea that the Bible is the only authority? Rejected. Trent said church tradition was just as important as the Bible, giving the Pope massive power. It also made the Latin Vulgate the only official Bible and said nobody could interpret it without the church's permission. They went down the list of every Protestant belief and hardened the Catholic position. This wasn't just theology, it was about control. The council gave bishops more power to hunt down heretics. It created the Index of Forbidden Books, basically creating massive censorship. And it powered up the Inquisition. The result wasn't healing, it was deeper division. Trent created a fortress Catholicism where anyone outside the walls was an enemy of God and a target. It fueled the religious wars that tore Europe apart for 100 years. Of course, the Protestants did the same thing. When Puritan ministers in England started holding their own Bible studies, Queen Elizabeth I, the head of the new Protestant Church of England, saw it as a threat and had them shut down. What both of these show is a brutal truth about organized religion. When an institution feels threatened, its first move is to demand conformity. Disagreement becomes treason, and councils become weapons in a war for control. This is the dark political side of the story they always leave out. Section 5. Modern cracks in the foundation. It's easy to look at these stories of scandals and cover-ups and think, that was a long time ago. We're better than that now. We want to believe the modern church has moved past the impulse to protect power over people. But the same patterns of hypocrisy and institutional self-preservation are happening right now in front of our eyes. If you think this is ancient history, let me tell you about Ravi Zacharias. For decades, this guy was a superstar of Christian apologetics. He debated at top universities, spoke to world leaders, and was seen by millions as a brilliant, morally perfect defender of the faith. His ministry, RZIM, was a global empire. When he died in May 2020, people called him a modern-day saint. Just a few months later, that image was completely destroyed. Allegations came out from massage therapists who worked at spas he co-owned. They described a pattern of sexual harassment and abuse. At first, RZIM denied everything, but the pressure grew and they hired a law firm to investigate. The final report, released in February 2021, was an absolute bombshell. It was a nightmare. The investigation confirmed the abuse and uncovered a secret life of predatory behavior that went on for years. The report found evidence of sexting, unwanted touching, spiritual abuse, and rape. Investigators found contacts for over 200 massage therapists on his phones and hundreds of pictures of young women, some naked. This wasn't one mistake. This was a calculated long-term pattern of deception and exploitation by a man who preached absolute truth. Even worse was how the institution enabled him. The report showed that RZIM gave him little to no accountability. He had total freedom, using secret phones and emails with zero oversight. And they had been warned before. In 2017, he had secretly settled a lawsuit with a woman who accused him of grooming her. At the time, he played the victim, and his ministry backed him up, letting him silence his accuser. The investigation proved the organization had a history of ignoring victims to protect its brand and its star. The need to protect the institution, its reputation, and its income created a culture where a predator could thrive. The Ravi Zacharias scandal is a modern-day version of the darkest parts of church history. It shows how unchecked power corrupts. It exposes the instinct to deny and cover up, the same instinct we saw after the Mountain Meadows massacre. It shows how the language of faith can be twisted into a weapon. This is not a one-off thing. The modern church is filled with similar scandals. These are not mistakes. They are the predictable result of institutions that treat their leaders as gods and care more about their own survival than they do about the truth or the people they are supposed to serve. The cracks in the foundation are not from the past. They are right under our feet. The stories we've gone through today are just the beginning. They're the chapters they ripped out of your history book. What other hidden histories of the church do you know about? What are the stories they never taught you? Let me know in the comments below. We need to talk about this. And if you believe we need to expose these uncomfortable truths to have a more honest faith, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We are just getting started on uncovering the history they tried to hide. Why was this hidden? So why don't we know this history? Why were we fed the clean highlight reel instead of the insane, complicated, and often horrifying truth? It wasn't a conspiracy. The answer is simpler. This history was hidden by a pattern repeated for centuries, driven by three things: power, purity, and preservation. First, power. History is shaped by people who want to keep their authority. Crushing the Montanists was about the bishops winning. The Council of Trent was a massive power grab by the Pope. Destroying the Nauvoo expositor was a leader exercising raw power because he couldn't let himself be exposed.